Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Back to Watercolors. I know it's been a long time since we've had another episode, and I'm really excited to get back into the series and see it to its conclusion. I'm so excited to share 3 unique watercolor palettes with you, each with its own special qualities. Today we'll explore a palette designed to mix beautiful skin tones, a collection of handmade shimmer watercolors, and then lastly, I'm going to be sharing some handmade watercolors that I created myself. I'll be using each palette separately, and then for the last portrait, I want to use them together. In this way, I get to show how my handmade watercolors can act as a companion to your already existing watercolor setup. If you haven't watched the first episode of Back to Watercolors, I would recommend that you do check it out because it does share a lot more of the watercolors I have. This is just a small selection of watercolors that I have and what has changed in the palette. I have grown a couple of my handmade watercolors, and I've also expanded my main palette that I showed you previously that has one side primary colors and then the other side is all the colors I use to mix my skin tones. Those colors that I use to mix my skin tones are non-granulating colors. And then I do have a couple of these handmade shimmer watercolors, and as you can see, my palette has changed so much. I've noticed that I've started gravitating a lot towards red shimmer watercolors. I feel like this year I've been gravitating a lot towards like redder tones, at least for this month. And then here is some of the handmade watercolors that I have. Most of them are duplicates of colors that I didn't have enough to fill a complete pan, so I kept them for myself. And then this is the handmade watercolor palette, just one of them. This handmade watercolor set is a primary set that I made specifically for myself that is very close and dear to my heart because it's my own handmade watercolors. And I curated these pigments to give me a solid primary mixing set, but also experiment with the Zorn palette and the Payne's Gray color. I wanted to make my own kind of Payne's Gray color, but also have it be a substitution to the Zorn palette without the addition of white. I spent months experimenting with pigments and binders to create these handmade watercolors, and I do still have a couple of sets left on my Etsy shop if you're interested in checking them out. Each color is hand molded and packaged with rich, vibrant pigments, and as you can see, they are granulating, and you'll be able to see that more once I finish the portrait. I've designed each of my handmade watercolors to be versatile for portraits, landscapes, and anything in between. And I wanted to showcase them in this video because I think it's important to be able to share that you don't need a large watercolor set to be able to make a beautiful painting. And it's something that I wish I knew well beforehand, but I do love collecting paint, so that's a whole separate issue on its own, or maybe it's not an issue, I don't know. For the first portrait, I focused on mixing natural skin tones. I build up the layers slowly by first starting with my base layer, and then I pivoted to painting the hair. That's because I like my watercolors to be able to sit and give them time to dry a little bit on the paper before I start adding more watercolors on top of my first base layer. That is because I want to make sure that I'm not lifting the base layer once I start adding the shadow layer. Something that I want to put into more practice is making sure that I do have a base layer or base color foundation, and sometimes layering that up depending on what style I'm looking for. I do believe one common pitfall that most beginner artists fall into, and what I fall into a lot too or get trapped in, is trying to find a cohesive color palette. The best tip and advice that I can give you is start with a limited cohesive color palette and then pick one color that is your pop color, whether that's like a red or blue or green, something that isn't in your normal palette but kind of stands out on its own. With this limited palette, I don't have like that popping color, but The red does kind of give you a little bit of pop of color, especially because I'm mixing a lot of the brown skin tones. 2 out of 3 of these colors are also pure pigments, which means that they're not custom mixes. The blue is a custom mix. The reason why I call it a Payne's Gray Zoran palette is because I've always had a fascination with limited palettes and having a cohesive color palette in general. And the Zoran palette really intrigued my interest because it's really good for so many things, and especially portraits, and that's something that's very interesting to me. But the limitation with the Zoran palette was it was originally created by an oil painter, and I do not paint with oils, so I tried to make it work for me with my gouache palette, and I wanted to make something that was reminiscent to the Zoran palette with my handmade watercolors. And in my research to discover what I was going to use to substitute the black pigment, I discovered Payne's Gray and the history behind the pigment and what the original pigment properties were. So I set out to formulate a almost Payne's Gray color using a lot of the original pigments that were part of the original artist custom mix Payne's Gray. And originally the artist William Payne was an English watercolorist. I think he also painted in oils as well, but he did have original custom mix that he made, and it was using Persian blue, yellow ochre, and crimson lake, and he mixed those 3 colors together to get that Payne's Gray look to his paintings. And over time, that custom mix has become a tube of paint that you can purchase, and it's one of my favorite alternatives to using black, and it was his alternative to using black. It's one of my favorite colors, and I also wanted to incorporate that into my own palette. And so I used 3 colors that are very similar to what he would have used to mix his Payne's Gray, and on top of that I made a custom blue that's almost like a Prussian blue that can also help give you that dark rich blue, but also help you reach that maybe historical Payne's Gray color that he used in his paintings. And it's one of my favorite like history and combination with art, and it's a custom palette that is really dear to my heart and that I love very, very much. I think for this portrait I chose the color palette really well. In the original photograph, the woman is very red leaning. She has very bold red makeup, and her outfit has a bright red jacket or like undershirt, and so I thought that this limited palette would be really good to use. And then I also added a little bit of shimmer watercolors to the shadows of her jacket and in the background to give it a pop of color and something really cute and shimmery. And maybe I am just a girl and I love my shimmery sparkly watercolors. The next palette I would like to reintroduce you to is my primary watercolor palette. This is my go-to watercolor palette for human portrait paintings. On one side I have my core mixing primary set by Daniel Smith, and then on the other side I have my core skin tone mix palette that I specifically picked out and curated with lots of trial and error for mixing skin tones. And so if you don't know, if you haven't watched my past videos way back, I used to primarily paint my portraits in gouache, and one thing I was discovering is that I was getting a lot of granulation and also streakiness with painting the way that I did with gouache, and part of that was water control and something that I had to learn in my journey, but the other half of that was because I wasn't really familiar with pigments in the first place, and something that I in my journey with watercolors and gouache and making my own handmade watercolors, had to learn. And there's things that I didn't know, like granulation and tinting strength and so much. And a lot of that kind of goes out the window with gouache, but also some of it's very important too. And when I started out painting portraits, I was mixing ultramarine blue to make my dark skin tones. And ultramarine blue is a very granulating watercolor, and it's also a very granulating gouache color. So I was getting a lot of granulation with my portrait, and I didn't necessarily want that look. It wasn't a look that I was going for when I wanted to paint portraits. So I had to go back to the drawing board and rediscover what I was looking for and what kind of look I was looking for. I also had to re-fall in love with granulation and rediscover how I wanted to use granulation in my watercolor practice. And now in 2025, I can fully say with my full chest that I love granulation. I love granulating watercolors. They are so cool. They're so much fun, but you have to know what you're going into and you have to understand them. And I didn't understand them and I didn't love them at first, but now I love them, and I have so many granulating watercolors that I love. But now that I understand them, I can find colors that work for me and my palette that are not granulating that I can use for my portrait work. The main color that is the powerhouse to my portrait is Quinacridone Gold Deep, and this is PO48 by Core. I do not use the Quinacridone Gold Deep from Daniel Smith because it is a custom mix, and I already have one of the colors that's in that formula, so if I wanted to mix them, I could mix it on my own. I just wanted to have something that was not custom. The next color that I want to introduce to you that is a new color in this palette is Pyroline Violet. It does definitely help me mix my really dark skin tones, and I'm really glad that I have this in my palette. And then the next color, I believe I already shared that this color was in my palette, but I do have Shadow Green to also help me mix my really dark skin tones. It's also a really good way to mix black. I think for me personally in my art making journey, I like to mix my own blacks instead of using a pre-mixed black. I think maybe I would make a custom black, having more custom blacks, because I think you get more subtleties you get more subtleties of color when you can have like a custom mixing color. So Perylene Green is one of those colors, and this Perylene Green is by Holbein. So I did start this portrait very similar to how I started the other portrait. I started with my base layer, and then I did do another layer of watercolor on top. Sometimes with your base layer, it's not for me as deep or dark as I want it to be, and that's kind of the tricky thing with watercolor and gouache. Sometimes the color shift is not exactly what you think it's going to be. So again, I let my paints dry just a little bit, and I work on the hair while the face is drying, so I'm not at risk of lifting the layer that was at the bottom. That is something that I have been working on, is patience and giving my watercolors time to dry in between layers. Sometimes I can be very, very impatient in wanting to finish painting the face, but if you're impatient, especially with watercolors, it's not going to reward you at all. It's going to make everything so much more difficult. I feel like slowing down and having patience has become a very big theme for me this month. I have been struggling with feeling like I have to do so much in such a short amount of time. And no one's telling me that I have to do this. It's all just in my mind. It's just me putting too much pressure on myself, and it doesn't lead me to being very successful. So I've been trying to remind myself that I have time to do things. I have time to practice. Like right now in my sketchbook, I have time to make art and make ceramics and do all the things that I want to do for the new year. I don't have to do it all in just 1 month and then just be like, okay, I'm done for the rest of the year. That's not how it works. But it's definitely been a theme and something I've been needing to confront within myself this month, and I'm hoping that I feel better and feel like I know I've done so much this month, and I feel like I want to be able to tell myself that you did enough, you're okay, you've done enough, and there is more to do next month, but that's what makes it exciting and something to look forward to. One of the things I'm looking forward to is making more handmade watercolors. With this painting, I use both my handmade watercolors and my primary watercolor palette to show that handmade watercolors, even if it's not just mine, can be a companion to your professional paints. I have so many handmade watercolors that I've made, that I have bought from fellow creators, that are great additions to my already pre-existing palettes, because they're colors that I don't already have, and they're colors that are unique. They shimmer, they granulate, they do all kinds of cool things, and that's why I wanted to make my own handmade watercolors, is because watercolors are so cool and I wanted to share that with you. And that's kind of the point of this Back to Watercolor series, is to share how cool watercolors can be. And I hope you feel that they're very cool, and the more you practice, trust me, the more you practice, the more comfortable you get with them. I was completely uncomfortable with watercolors, and I tried to use gouache as watercolors and it didn't work out for me, so I had to get comfortable using watercolors, because I know that there was potential there and I knew what I was going for, and I just needed to be there for them. I just needed to be there for myself and practice. And if you need to be there for yourself, I hope you can find hope. I hope you can feel that you can do it too, and I hope these videos prove to you that you can do it too, because if I can do it, you can do it. I am the impatient painter and I want to go in and paint. I understand if you're like me, not wanting to practice, but every painting that you're doing is practice. Even if it's a final painting, I've practiced on quote unquote final paintings on my good paper, my good cotton paper, and now I'm just rediscovering how important it is to practice even in your sketchbook. And I am loving painting in this sketchbook. I learn something new about the sketchbook every time I paint in it. I think this is where I'm gonna sign off and leave you here. I hope you try something new in your sketchbook, even if it isn't handmade watercolors. Pull out your watercolors that you do already have and try something new in your sketchbook. Let me know if you want me to try something else or new in my sketchbook. Maybe give you some encouragement. And I hope to see you all very, very soon. Catch you in the next one. Bye. Take care.
Still rough around the edges. I guess that some things never change. Yeah, I know that it's been ages, but it kinda feels the same. No matter how hard I try, you cannot push me out, so just listen. I've been thinking of you since you broke it and moved to LA. And no matter how hard I try, I cannot get you out of my system. I know we both have some things left to say. Can you stay a little longer? Can I make you change your mind? Yeah, I know that it's over, but can we stay here for a while until everything's alright again? That's cool with you, cool with you, cool with you. 'Cause that's cool with me, cool with me, cool with me. Is that cool with you, cool with you, cool with you? 'Cause that's cool with me, cool with me, cool with me. Maybe I am selfish, 'cause I want you to myself. Yeah, I know your friends are waiting, since you broke it and moved to LA. And no matter how hard I try, I cannot get you out of my system. I know we both got some things left to say.